The story of David and Goliath has got to be one of the most well-known Bible stories of all time, right up there with the birth of Jesus and maybe Noah's Ark. It's a story with a moral that's been adopted by people of many faiths and also by those with no faith at all, except perhaps faith in themselves as they struggle to rise above the challenges of life. Who doesn't love a good underdog story? We imagine lousy odds for the skinny young guy up against a monster, but lo and behold, the kid wins. The giant seems to have all of the advantages. He's huge, at least 6 feet 9 inches, and he's got every modern weapon available to him in this Bronze Age. He's covered in armor, he has a sword, a javelin, and a spear. He's huge and well equipped. And he's backed by the state, which has provided an army right behind him. He seems unbeatable. David is smaller. He's come with no armor. He has low-tech weapons. He's a nobody, not even really a full adult, certainly not trained as a soldier. He appears to have no advantages at all. But don't let looks deceive you when it comes to either character in this story. David may only have a sling and stones, but the stopping power of that projectile is apparently very close to that of a .45 caliber bullet. He was fast, and he could see. Goliath stands head and shoulders over most men, and certainly over this boy, but it's been speculated that he suffered from a condition called acromegaly, a condition where the pituitary gland makes too much growth hormone in adulthood. He just meant that Goliath grew to be extraordinarily tall and big and heavy, and he also might have been quite nearsighted, a common side effect in that condition. He was big, but he was weighed down by armor so that he wouldn't have been especially fast, and his vision was likely impaired, and David had the advantage. The lesson that has been taken from this story is that size doesn't matter, and that if you're clever, you can win even if the odds appear stacked against you. Malcolm Gladwell even did a TED Talk on it. It's a common image referred to whenever someone is brave enough to take on a system, maybe a wealthy company or the government in a legal battle. Think Erin Brockovich. We've maybe even used the Goliath metaphor when we've had challenges of our own, when we feel that something is just too big to be overcome or too big to ever change. Now, this year, as we approached Orange Shirt Day, and this text was what I was supposed to preach on this Sunday, it got me thinking about the troubling history of the Indian residential schools and the giant that we must face, systemic racism that the church fully participated in supporting, endorsing, and even promoting. Many people who were not directly impacted feel that it's part of the past that should be forgotten, or forgiven at least, as having been something that they believe happened a long time ago. And people back then should be cut some slack, they claim, for everyone must have been well-intentioned, if a little misguided, or they hold that good Christians had little choice but to go with the flow, to be dominated by the giant of society that held such racist attitudes. It wasn't something they had personally believed to be true, but it was a system too big to be challenged or changed, too strong to be overcome. The front page article in this fall's Presbyterian Connection newspaper addresses the relationship between the church and the unmarked graves found at several Indian residential schools earlier this year. And I've drawn on that article liberally here for my message. The discovery of more than 1,000 unmarked graves has been shocking news to most of us in Canada, but only confirmed what Indigenous communities have long said. While people struggle to confront the grim reality of these schools and their legacy, some of the frequent questions being asked are, how could the church have done this? Are there unmarked graves at Presbyterian Church in Canada run schools too? And what can we do now to repent and work toward healing the harm that we, the church, have done? The answer to the first two questions is found in our, Canada, and the Presbyterian Church's colonial roots. The answer to the third question, how to bring down the giant in our midst, begins by working to redress and dismantle the harms of colonialism, a process known as decolonization. A little bit of background. The Presbyterian Church in Canada operated 11 residential schools as part of an organized project of colonization and assimilation in which the federal government and other churches also participated. As the graves already found demonstrate, this project of colonization and assimilation can be called nothing short of genocide. Although the graves so far found were not located on PCC-run school grounds, it's likely that as the investigations continue, that there will be grim discoveries there too. The Presbyterian Church in Canada is committed to uncovering the truth of how many children did not make it home from the schools that we ran. And this process will be done in consultation with the communities impacted and in full accordance with their wishes. To understand what moved the church in the first place to participate in this genocide and to begin to imagine how we could work to dismantle this destructive structure, it's important to understand the ideology that shaped the church's interactions with Indigenous people. That ideology is systemic racism and exploitation growing out of what is commonly called the doctrine of discovery. Papal decrees in the late 14th and early 15th centuries proclaimed church endorsement of colonization. The decrees gave explicit permission to the monarch to take any land not occupied by Christians, take it for their own. It also included permission to exploit and abuse any non-Christian peoples living there. Pope Nicholas V granted full power through the apostolic authority by this edict to invade, conquer, fight, and subjugate the Saracens, pagans, infidels, and other enemies of Christ, and to lead their persons in perpetual servitude, and to apply and appropriate their realms, their possessions, and goods to this kind use and for your use to your successors. The decree and others that followed put into civil law the belief in the supremacy of Christian European culture and empires. Now, Protestant colonizers were no different, no better, putting into action their belief that God blessed their violence and that the lands occupied by Indigenous peoples were theirs for the taking. Furthermore, they also held that the inhabitants were savages in need of Christianizing. Reverend James Nisbet, a Presbyterian missionary, wrote that the work of the mission was to fill them, the Indigenous people, with an idea of the superiority of white people, and that might induce them to think well also of the religion that white people bring to them. Shocking as those words may seem, Nisbet was expressing beliefs commonly held by Christians at the time. Now, in the best case scenario, we could say that a genuine desire to introduce the saving story of Jesus to these people who had not heard of him was ultimately tragically mixed with a message of cultural superiority. In the worst case, this cultural superiority justified steps taken toward another culture's extinction. In 1972, not long after the scandal of the 60s scoop, where many Indigenous children were removed from their homes, their communities, their families of birth, and adopted out to predominantly white middle-class families across Canada, the Presbyterian Church declared that colonialism and racism that underscores it, underpins it, are incompatible with the gospel. Yet we see how both have significantly shaped how the church understood mission abroad and right here in our country. The church must expose and change how its understanding of the Bible and relationships with Indigenous people have been harmfully, culturally conditioned. Discipleship requires no less. Now, in 1994, the PCC confessed its role in running residential schools. And in 2019, the General Assembly repudiated the doctrine of discovery. Neither of those actions, however necessary, undoes what's already happened. Apologies and repudiations of the ideologies that framed colonialism do not undo the reality of children's graves, both marked and unmarked, associated with residential schools. They don't undo the devastating harms and intergenerational trauma the schools and other forms of colonialism have caused. And so part of the discipleship today is working to dismantle the structures that allowed such things and redressing the harms that have come of them. Generations of Indigenous peoples have been harmed, and it will take generations of hard work for healing to redress that harm. Now, some steps have been taken by the PCC in recent months even. There have been funds made available to help Indigenous communities search school grounds, as well as provide support for dealing with the trauma that those findings will undoubtedly trigger. And these must be the first steps of many. But, as I say, every journey begins with one step. Understanding that the church has caused deep pain and harm, we must listen, repent, and acknowledge the wishes and guidance of the Indigenous communities and families impacted by our actions. To echo what many Indigenous people are saying in the light of the discovery of more and more graves, some of which are likely to be found on Presbyterian-run schools, healing must come before reconciliation. We can't just forgive and forget. Perhaps our Goliath in this instance, the systemic racism, that unbeatable monster from our past, is being revealed to us today instead, not so much as this huge giant, but as a scarecrow. Just a bundle of rags made out of a heap of our old beliefs or expectations and entitlements. Without a doubt, like the Philistine state-supported army that backed David's Goliath, our belief over years gone by were propped up by the church and government attitudes of the day, but no longer. It's not good enough to say we didn't know then, because we do know now. It did not take just a couple of smooth stones, but 217 graves of small children to start to bring down that bundle of filthy rags and finally cause it to begin to lose its stuffing. Reverend Margaret Mullen, Thunder Eagle Woman is her Indigenous name, is a minister to the Place of Hope Indigenous Presbyterian Church in Winnipeg. That's Treaty 1 territory, home of the Cree, the Anishinaabe, and Dakota's people, and also home of the Métis Nation. And Margaret wrote an open letter to our denomination. Thundering Woman gives us a chance here at St. Andrew's Knox Fort Erie, just a couple of kilometers from our own Native Friendship Center, to consider what she thinks is clear direction on what to do next. She writes, "Open your mind. The truth needs to be known and accepted and deeply lamented. Accountability must be demanded. Justice must be seen in action. All Presbyterians inherit this legacy. Indigenous Presbyterians and their allies must all hold church and government accountable to do the right thing. Find the children, identify the children, get them home. Don't stop until they are all found. Make sure there are enough resources given to your Indigenous missions and ministries to help our Indigenous peoples heal. Help Indigenous communities to restore the languages beaten out of our elders, restore our relationship with Creator, recover our cultural identity, restore our spiritual way of life and practices and ceremony. We are intelligent enough and strong enough to do that ourselves, but we do not have the finances required to do a good job. In exchange for the land that was stolen, honor the treaties. Give us fair portion of what the land produces. Pay the rent you owe. Stop tolerating systemic racism in the healthcare system, education system, political system, social welfare system, child and family and foster care and adoption agencies, and in society in general. She concludes, with a heavy heart, I say, Miigwech, thank you for listening. All my relations. May it be so, Margaret.